wake up this morning thinking we were going to be talking about this, but here we are. Here we are.
And yet reality just gets weirder and more troubling every single day. We never thought after 2.5 years of COVID that we would be looking at World War III now. And don't panic, but Russia says that a nuclear catastrophe could happen at any moment. Just let me repeat that, okay? How's that for reality? Absorb that. Sit with that for a moment. A nuclear catastrophe could happen at any moment. And the head of the IAEA says the exact same thing. And it's all due to the continued shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, right? Which Russia claims is being done by Ukraine. That plant has been under full control of the Russians since they took it in March. Ukraine claims Russia's shelling its own nuclear power plant. It's the largest in Europe. Why would they do that? So who's telling the truth here? Let's figure out reality for ourselves, shall we? Because we're going to get two very different stories, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Or maybe one side's right and one side's lying. Surely, obviously, somebody is lying. The question is who. But we're going to run two different news reports for you. And just, I want to show you the complete disparity in the alternative sets of facts being given in Russian media versus the Western mainstream media. And first up, we have the intrepid, the wonderful Caleb Maupin reporting for RT.
If the attacks from the Ukrainian army continue, a nuclear catastrophe could happen at any moment. Then huge territories in Ukraine, Russia, and Europe will be under the threat of radioactive contamination. The real scale of a nuclear disaster at the plant is impossible to even imagine. In this case, the entire responsibility for this will fall on the Western sponsors of Kiev.
Well, at the 15-member body that leads the United Nations, the UN Security Council, in their chamber in Manhattan, we heard from the representative of Russia, who raised the alarm about the dangers posed by these attacks on this nuclear power facility. He emphasized the deals that Russia has offered to secure this power plant, to secure that we don't have some kind of nuclear disaster. Now, when the representative of the United States took to the floor, basically the U.S. representative said that any potential fallout or danger from the attacks on the nuclear power plant, they fall squarely on Russia's shoulders, simply because Russia is involved in this special operation. Here's the response of the United States to what seems like a very clear danger.
The cause of the situation at the Zaporizhzhia facility is not a mystery. It is another tragic result of the Russian Federation's decision to further invade its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine. Russia alone created risks, and it can eliminate those risks now by withdrawing from Ukraine.
Now, the Russian representative talked about how this fits a pattern. It talked about how the Ukrainian forces will embed themselves into civilian areas, using civilians in effect as human shields. And this is essentially nuclear blackmail. It's an attempt to force the Russian military out of a certain area, or else there could be some kind of disaster, which would then be blamed on Russia, even though it is Ukrainian forces that persist on escalating things near this power plant. Now, it's important to note, right, the fact that Russia is raising the alarm and has been raising the alarm about the dangers posed by attacks on this facility, and has been trying to get the International Atomic Energy Agency involved in dealing with these threats for months. And today at the UN Security Council meeting, we heard the head of the IAEA. He basically said that there is at this point no immediate threat.
The experts have preliminary assessed that there is no immediate threat to nuclear safety. However, this could change at any moment.
Russia and other countries like China called for a de-escalation of the situation and concerns about global safety. But from the United States and its allies, we heard a mantra of blaming everything on Russia, saying that there wasn't such a danger, but if there was, the fallout would simply be Russia's fault. It seemed that the United States and its allies were not concerned about the potential fallout and seemed to be using the danger of nuclear disaster as a measure or a wedge with which to try and pressure Russia to withdraw from certain areas.
The great Caleb Maupin, one of my favorite RT reporters, been following that guy on RT for a decade. Miss him on RT America. I miss RT America, but at least he's still got a job at RT, flagship RT. But I would like you now to compare and contrast what you just saw on RT to this CNN coverage of the exact same story, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And this, what we're going to show you, is an interview with British journalist John Sweeney. And I use that word very loosely, referring to Mr. Sweeney. I'll explain why I'm not a fan after
Is
the
this
clip.
is this the clip, a fragile monster?
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought
the
so. Okay.
fragile monster.
Want to make sure
He's talking about
around.
Putin, of course. He's just written a new book about Putin called Killer in the Kremlin. I'm serious. And it's got this really dark, ominous cover art, which you will see here in this clip. And he's here as an expert because, after all, he must be a smart guy. He went to the London School of Economics and was, indoctrinated by the best. And he worked at the BBC for 17 years until he was pushed out, fired, resigned over a scandal. I'll explain all that later. But I just want you to watch this clip and tell me if he seems like a authoritative, scholarly, believable expert on this subject. Let's see how CNN reported it.
He's all too familiar with Putin's tactics. He's out with a new book on the Russian leader called Killer in the Kremlin. And he joins me now. Welcome to the program, John. So this is not the first time we are talking about potential catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia power plant. Just a few months ago, there had been shelling around that plant as well, and the IAEA had been sounding alarms then too. Why do you think Russia continues to make such dangerous steps that could not only impact Ukraine, obviously, but Europe at large?
You've got to understand, Bianna, that Vladimir Putin has been, as a teenager, something like when he was 12, he found a mentor who changed his life, and this mentor was a gangster. When he ran a mixed martial arts club, which Putin went to in St. Petersburg. And when this mentor died, on his gravestone, the phrase was, "I am dead, but the mafia is immortal." We're dealing with the crime boss of the Gambino family or somebody like this. And what he likes to do, and this is absolutely part of his playbook, is to threaten terrifying violence. And one of the things that Europe and the whole world is afraid of is some kind of nuclear disaster. So I think what's happening in reality is that the Russians and the Russian army, the Russian killing machine, is failing. It's not doing very well. They reversed out of the Battle of Kiev. They lost that. Then they went to the east, and they got the Lugansk county or oblast. Yes, that's true. But that cost an awful lot of Russian blood and treasure. They haven't yet secured the Donetsk oblast in its entirety, and the Ukrainians have made them fight very, very hard for that. But then the American long-range rocket artillery, the HIMARS system, I think it's changed the game, and it's blasted at least 12 major Russian ammo dumps. And so what I think we're looking at is Putin trying to frighten Europe, trying to frighten the world by saying we can shell these places. Now, practically, these nuclear power stations are very, very strongly built. Yes, I know about Chernobyl, and I write about it in my book, but that was a massive internal disaster because the actual design of the reactor was wrong, and the Soviets knew about it, and they suppressed it rather than tackling it. That's the problem with this kind of system. because it's
But
not
any
a
system, I
democracy.
would imagine, would not be built to sustain continued rocket attacks. I mean, no one would imagine that that there would be a war ensuing where you have Russian troops not only infiltrate the facility, but also it appears now focusing on strategically, at least as you're saying, to garner a threat to the rest of the world, attempts to sabotage a nuclear facility.
Yes, but what he's doing is he's trying to generate fear. That's his playbook. Do not mess with me. Do as I say, or you will suffer.
Is it working?
Well, I think the Ukrainian army beg to differ. And the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people are saying, we know who you are, we know what you're like, and we're standing up to you. And obviously this is kind of worrying, but there are a number of reasons, which I set out in my book, that I think that Vladimir Putin is a fragile monster. And I don't think that his strategy is working. I think this war is a catastrophic mistake for humanity, for Ukraine, for Russia, but also for Vladimir Putin's grip on power. And let me take you through some of those reasons. First of which is Alexei Navalny, who is the effective leader of the opposition. He's locked up. He's a great critic of Putin. He's a great critic of the war. And yet he's still alive. Vladimir Putin could kill him like that, but why not? Because Vladimir Putin is afraid of having him killed in prison, because he fears that people in Moscow and St. Petersburg will rise up and say, what are you doing?
But
Secondly,
can I just push you back on
yes.
that? Because even Navalny's own team had said as soon as this war began that Navalny's life was at its greatest risk yet since he had been arrested once he returned to Russia. Because if there was ever a time for him to be killed in prison, it would be then. That they also did not believe that Vladimir Putin would go this far and invade Ukraine. And that having been said, when you're talking about people on the streets in Moscow and Leningrad, revolting in outrage, yes, they came out in support for him when he came back to Russia, but we don't see that many people on the streets there. We know there's a lot of suppression, but we don't see that many people, even at the height of their protests in the early days of this war, out protesting against the Kremlin.
The point is that Navalny is still alive. So that Putin, if he was all powerful, he could have him, he's his great adversary, Navalny, and he's still alive. That, to me, suggests weakness, not strength. Secondly, he hasn't called for universal conscription. And again, the reason for that is he's afraid that people in Moscow and St. Petersburg will say, why on earth are you sending my 18-year-old son for your stupid war? And so time and again, I've seen this on the outskirts of Bucha in early April. The Russian soldiers we saw weren't ethnic Russians. They were Buryats, Russian Mongols from
ethnic minorities,
very close to
right?
China. Yes, exactly. So he is not using the salt. Now, why is that? The reason, again, I think, is because he's afraid that if he calls for universal conscription, mums and dads in Moscow and St. Petersburg will say, we're going to protest against this. We do not want our sons go to war. And there is a series of things like this. I also think that if, for example, Putin hits the nuclear button, I do not believe that button will work, because I think the Kremlin machinery doesn't like this war and is unhappy with him. We also hear that the gossip is the CIA have said to the Russians, if you use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, things will not go well for you. What they specifically said is that we will target Russian military places with masses of conventional cruise missiles, but in a way that will humiliate Putin and the Russian killing machine without escalating to nuclear. So we're in a game of threats with somebody who, I say in my book, he's not just a killer, he's a serial killer. He's pathologically enthralled to violence and to threats. And he threats again and again and again. And if we give him what he wants, he will only ask for more. And I think what we're looking at here with the nuclear story, yes, it's alarming, but at the same time, it's part of his playbook. And the best way to see the end of this war is to give the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people the money and the heavy metal they need to defeat the Russian killing machine.
Is the
We have to stop him. He's a serial killer. You heard the man.
We have to give them as much money as they want and all the weapons that they want too. Just give them lots more money and weapons.
Or they'll nuke us.
Yeah.
It's playing on your fear.
They're lobbying projectiles at a nuclear plant that they control so they can scare people. That makes sense. They bomb themselves.
Oh, here comes the black
Scare people.
helicopters. Do you hear it?
warn your
There's a helicopter over my house that's flying
Oh.
really low.
Uh-oh.
They're coming to take me away. Ha ha.
Well, I'm not surprised. You're on here with me. I warned you. It's guilt
You
by
did. You
association.
tried to. I didn't
in
listen.
your opinion now at an inflection point as we see continued fighting there, obviously in the east, we are seeing Russia now regroup and send some of their troops to the south there as Ukraine is trying steadfastly to reclaim some of that territory that Russia has taken, specifically around Kherson. There have
They
been
took
analysts
territory?
that
I thought they were
perhaps now
losing.
with the HIMARS and the
Didn't they say they
additional
were
support,
losing?
both
She just
financially and
admitted, yes,
militarily
they're
from the
taking
United
territory.
States, largely that this is an inflection point, a turning point for the Ukrainians. Do you agree?
I think there will be one soon, but I also think the Americans are supplying the Ukrainians with the ammo and the big long guns. And the price of that is the Americans are saying to Ukrainians, please do as we ask you to do. And Ukrainians are complying, partly because they've got no choice. But the American policy on this is softly, softly. What they're trying to do is, I think the other day they've announced $1 billion in
Yes.
defense aid, but normally it's less than that, 700 million. They're saying to the Ukrainians, you can't have our best jets, you can't have our best tanks, you can't have our best armored personnel carriers. That's a deliberate policy. What they're trying to do is to prevent Putin from seeing one single piece of aid or a piece of kit as something which will allow him to escalate to a new threshold of violence. And that's a deliberate American policy if you study it. I don't necessarily agree with it. I just think the faster you destroy the Russian killing machine, the faster Putin will be in trouble. And then we can hope that there is a new Russia under somebody far better. Let's hope so. But the American policy is consistent and I think smart. So what they're
Consistently
doing
bad.
is they're making it much more difficult. What it is they're boiling the Russian frog slowly. They're
Oh.
not dumping the frog in the heat. They're slowly turning up the heat again
I
and
get
again
you.
and
So
again.
they're
I've heard of
good.
the Russian
They're
bear, but
losing
the
on
Russian frog?
purpose.
And at some
They're
point, the
losing on
Ukrainians will get
purpose
person,
to just
I think, will get it
reel
back
in
and
the
then they'll
Russians.
move, further
And then after
east
they
and they'll
lose
move
enough, then
south.
they're
I
going to
say
make
this
their
because
move.
I know my Ukrainian friends are such, their spirit is so high, their morale is so high compared to the Russians.
Well, there's another miscalculation as we close here on Vladimir Putin's part as well. He thought he would get Kyiv in 3 days, and here we are 6 months later.
Yeah. So
John,
the longer the war,
Yeah.
the worse it is for Vladimir Putin. He's a fragile monster.
I'm thinking the longer the war, the worse it is for the taxpayers in Canada and the U.S.
And Europe. The whole
Mhm.
world.
That's right.
So, what did you think of John Sweeney there, Rick, as a journalist of many years? Are you familiar with Mr. Sweeney? You ever
I don't
seen him?
really. No, I'm not really that familiar with him. No.
Does he strike you as a trustworthy, authoritative source on how Vladimir Putin's mind works? I mean, he wrote a book about him, so he must be pretty smart.
Well, when you write a book, it makes you an authority automatically. You don't even have to go to school. You just have
But
to
he
write
did.
a book.
He went to a good school. He went to the socialist LSE, London School of Economics, where all of the globalist power players go.
And he learned how to spell the words Russian killing machine.
He called Vlad a serial killer. Wow.
Mhm.
That was, if you didn't know anything about him, you might just buy what he's selling because he's presented to you as an authority on CNN. But let me take just a moment to tell you a little bit about John Sweeney and his background, because I think that informs your decision as to whether you want to believe this or not. He worked for the BBC for 17 years. I know we have a lot of British viewers out there, so I'm sure you folks are familiar with him. I think he did Panorama, the big show Panorama. And then he was fired in 2019 over a scandal involving a hit piece documentary he did on the right-wing activist Tommy Robinson. And thousands of Robinson supporters protested. You might remember this. It was all over the news. They were protesting outside the BBC studios, demanding he resign for slandering Tommy Robinson. But that wasn't the first time that Sweeney had been caught lying about someone. He was successfully sued for defamation before in France when he defamed a French citizen. He has been defaming Vladimir Putin for many years. If you read his articles on Russia and Ukraine over the past decade, you'll see this guy is just frothing at the mouth over Vlad the monster. I mean, Sweeney has been pushing the totally false narrative that Trump and Putin are in cahoots since 2015. And since the war in Ukraine started, Sweeney has been comfortably ensconced at a luxury hotel in Kyiv, where he's, one of those war correspondents who never actually goes to the front lines. But he's an expert. He knows what's really going on. And he knows how Vladimir Putin's mind works. Although I think he's only interviewed him once. He did interview Putin once several years ago. And now he's got this new book out, Killer in the Kremlin. Now, is that propaganda?
That's pretty catchy. That's pretty catchy. It's a good title.
Scary looking cover, too. They always take that picture of Putin, like with the extreme close up on his evil eyes, looking at you like, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to eat your babies.
It's a good title. It's kind of like, I don't know. What are some other good ones? Like Helter Skelter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like they're making a Manson character out of him, a Charles Manson character, serial killer. And he's got all these brainwashed minions, who do what he says or else, because he'll kill you. And the Navalny thing, if Navalny was really such a threat to Putin and Putin was this killer, why hasn't he killed him? Why is Navalny just sitting in prison?
This argument that the Russians are bombing that nuclear facility when the Russians control it makes no sense at all.
None.
It's just
whatsoever.
But a lot of people will buy it, right?
They believe that Russia have shelled its own POW camps too, twice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Makes no sense.
None at all.
А кто Берлин-то взял штурмом? Американцы, что ли? Англичане или французы? Красная армия. Подзабыли?
Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова